Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating personal journal titled Cadet Chronicles. This is an incredible inside look at a 10-day National Cadet Corps, or NCC, camp up in Sikkim, and it's told entirely from the perspective of a student named Aarush. We're not just looking at a dry log of daily activities here. This is a raw, first-hand account of a massive personal transformation. We actually get to follow Aarush as he transitions from a hesitant, super anxious student who, fun fact, was literally the very last person from his school to register, into this highly inspired, disciplined cadet. So let's walk through these 10 days and see exactly how a high-altitude boot camp can completely rewire a young person's outlook. Now, before Aarush even packed his bags, he was hit with a massive reality check. While his parents are signing the standard consent forms, he is handed a letter featuring this intensely heavy sentence: "It is not anyone's fault, but my fault if I die." Imagine being a high school student and having to put your pen to paper on that. It instantly establishes the incredibly high stakes of this camp. We're talking military-grade training here, not a casual summer retreat. And that liability waiver made absolutely sure these young cadets knew exactly what they were signing up for.
So heading into this, Aarush was caught in a serious internal tug-of-war. On one hand, he had his highly anticipated second-term exams looming in early September. On the other, he had this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to attend the NCC camp in late August. And to put this into perspective, it had been nearly 40 years since his school, St. Paul's, had sent any students to an NCC camp. Naturally, he was totally anxious about balancing his studies, but his parents gave him some incredibly wise advice. As long as he wasn't failing, the experiences from this camp would be far more relevant to his life than any single exam. He essentially had to choose the uncomfortable path of real-world experience over the familiar anxiety of the classroom.
Section 1, Boot Camp Shock and Awe. On August 21st, Aarush and 9 other boys from St. Paul's arrived at Sikkim Alpine University, and let me tell you, their small private school bubble instantly popped. Just the sheer scale of the operation, lining up to get registered with biometrics by Army officers alongside over 500 other cadets, was a completely overwhelming introduction to their new reality. The biggest shock on day one actually wasn't the physical exhaustion. It was a bizarre social isolation. Aarush and his peers found themselves shoved into a dorm with over 40 other cadets, but they instantly hit a massive language barrier. Aarush's group primarily spoke English and Hindi, while a huge chunk of the other boys from the Darjeeling region spoke Nepali. And what happens when over 40 teenagers can't easily talk to each other? They retreat right to their screens. Aarush notes the total irony of being surrounded by dozens of new peers, yet everyone just isolated themselves on their smartphones. It resulted in almost zero conversation on that very first day. So how exactly do you bring order to 500 teenagers? You establish a very strict hierarchy on night one. At the top, you have the actual Army instructors who are running the whole show. In the middle, acting as the crucial bridge, are the C certificate seniors. These are older cadets who functioned a lot like school prefects, making sure the rules were followed in the dorms. Aarush points out that his dorm senior was thankfully pretty kind and lenient. And right at the bottom, grouped into companies like Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Aarush's company Delta, were the junior cadets. This clear chain of command was absolutely vital for maintaining the discipline required to keep hundreds of kids in line. By day 2, the grueling reality of their new schedule really hit home. They were up before dawn at 5 a.m. By 6 a.m., they're out for an hour-long jog on hilly, pitched roads pushing toward the town of Namche. And we're not talking a light morning jog here. This included 50 push-ups and squats right in the middle of a steep uphill climb. But here is a brilliantly unexpected detail Aarush put in his journal. After that exhausting morning, everyone unanimously agreed that the breakfast, and in fact all the meals at this government-sponsored camp, was actually way better than the food back at their fancy private school. Right after breakfast came the Army drills. For these young trainees, this wasn't just about learning how to properly wear a beret, it was a front-row seat to witnessing true leadership. What really stuck with Aarush was watching an Army Havildar, which is a non-commissioned officer rank. Aarush was just in absolute awe watching this Havildar effortlessly project his voice to command over 400 cadets outside with absolutely no microphone. Seeing that level of raw physical command and presence for the first time was deeply, deeply impressive for a young student. Section 2, Rifles and Realities. As that initial shock wore off, the cadets transitioned from basic discipline into the core of military training, map reading, fieldcraft, and studying the legendary heroes of the Indian Army who won the Parambir Chakra. But before they could even think about touching a real weapon, they had to study it. Aarush carefully jotted down the specs of the .22 MKV rifle. Made in Yugoslavia, an entire meter long and weighing a heavy 4 kilograms. On day 3, they practiced on a digital simulator, shooting at a screen into thin air. Aarush actually did pretty well, hitting 3 out of 4 digital targets. But really, this was all just to build up the anticipation for the next day. The day they would finally hold the very thing most boys their age only ever see in video games. 5,000 feet above sea level. This number perfectly captures both the physical altitude and the emotional peak of Aarush's camp experience on day 4. He laid down on the mat, held that real 4-kilogram rifle for the very first time, and looked down his sights. He wrote that he literally felt like he was at the top of the world. Even though his beginner's luck faded just a bit, he hit 2 out of his 5 live targets. The sheer thrill of the experience was totally unmatched. For him, it was hands down the absolute highlight of the 10 days. Section 3. Culture, Conflict, and Camaraderie. Because let's face it, putting 500 exhausted teenagers in a high-pressure environment for over a week is a guaranteed recipe for testing their emotional maturity just as much as their muscles. Thankfully, Day 5 offered a much-needed cultural breather. The cadets were taken to Sideshwar Dham, also known as Char Dham, over in Namchi. For 2 solid hours, they got to step entirely out of their military routine to explore the beautiful replicas of the 4 main pilgrimage sites of Hinduism. Aarush bought souvenirs for his family, enjoyed some local food, and it served as a perfect moment of peace to ground the students in the local culture before they were thrown right back into the strict routine. But of course, that peace didn't last forever. It brings up a really crucial question. How do you handle discipline when it feels entirely, 100%, unfair? By day 8, exhaustion was creeping in hard, and patience was running incredibly thin across the entire camp. Aarush and his friends were about to face their biggest test of emotional maturity yet, and it actually had nothing to do with obstacle courses. Remember that language barrier we talked about earlier? Well, it suddenly became a massive problem. During a rest period, an aggressive senior who was clearly in a bad mood walked into Aarush's dorm and literally slapped a sleeping cadet named Edward awake. When Aarush's group furiously demanded an apology, the senior spun the story in Nepali to the prefect. Unable to defend themselves or even understand what was being said, the narrative flipped completely. Edward was actually forced to apologize, and to top it all off, a teacher, Mr. Sunam, unfairly scolded the boys. It was a deeply frustrating, crushing lesson in miscommunication and injustice. Section 4. Transformation and Triumph. Fortunately, the closing days of the camp proved that the utter exhaustion and the unfair scoldings were entirely worth it, culminating in some seriously tangible success. And the results were just incredible. Out of the 10 students from St. Paul's who attended the camp, they took home 6 medals, 5 silvers and 1 gold. Aarush himself won his first ever medal, a silver for elocution. On top of that, his assigned house, Delta Company, actually won the entire camp's obstacle race cup. Think about it. The boys who had shown up lacking plates and glasses on day 1 were now standing at the closing ceremonies, bursting with pride, completely decorated with medals. As Aarush was packing his bags on day 9, he received his camp completion certificate and his share of the travel allowance, which was about 8,200 rupees. And in that moment, a very specific memory came rushing back to him. It was the prophetic words his father had told him when he first, reluctantly, registered for the camp. NCC is going to help you a lot in the future. Finally, after 10 days of sweat, discipline, and unfair scoldings, those words deeply resonated with him. His father was absolutely right. The long-term impact of those 10 days was already locking into place. Aarush's personal journey had completely come full circle. He started out as a student totally obsessed with his upcoming September exams, absolutely terrified of a liability waiver. He left as a fiercely determined cadet. He even exchanged contact info with the boys from regional schools, finally bridging that massive day 1 language barrier and forming real, lasting bonds. But more importantly, the camp instilled a brand new inspiration within him, a genuine desire to eventually join the armed forces of his country, no matter how hard the path might be. He even vowed to return for his A certificate exams the very next year. A simple 10-day camp in the hills of Sikkim completely shifted the trajectory of Aarush's entire future. It forced him way out of his comfort zone, pushed his physical limits, and introduced him to a world so much bigger than his classroom. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to take away from this explainer. What uncomfortable journey or intimidating challenge are you waiting to say yes to? Because just like Aarush, stepping into the unknown might just be the best decision you ever make. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.